Hello, and thank you for tuning in to Memo's weekly review with me, Nasim Ahmed, and my regular guest, Mouin Rabbani. Hello, Mouin. Good to have you here again.
Hi, Nasim. Always a pleasure to be with you.
So this week we'll spend some time talking about the incident in Amsterdam. You are in Holland right now, so we will speak about the ultra nationalist football fans from Maccabi Haifa
Maccabi Tel
and
Aviv.
Maccabi Tel Aviv, sorry. Then we'll speak about Trump's second term as well, what that means for the MENA region. And Netanyahu sacking Yoav Galant. I think many have been expecting his sacking for a while, actually. The two haven't been seeing eye to eye on a number of issues. And also Netanyahu appointing an ex-member of a Jewish terror organization to be his envoy in Washington. I don't think if people have been following this, it would have come as a surprise, especially now that Trump has been re-elected. So we'll discuss that as well. And also the Riyadh summit, which is taking place on Monday, which is the day we are recording this program. And also Doha's decision to no longer be the mediator unless both parties, Israel and Hamas, are willing to negotiate in good faith. But before we get to all those other topics, let's begin, as we normally do, with the situation in northern Gaza. Israel has announced that Palestinians will not be allowed to return to their homes in northern Gaza. And that news was drowned out by the US elections. I think it was intentionally made at the time of the US election to cover the fact that this is really an admission of ethnic cleansing. Is that how you see it now, Moin? Everyone knew that this was a plan of ethnic cleansing and genocide, but this is now Israelis themselves saying that, admitting that they will no longer allow Palestinians to return to northern Gaza, which is really an admission of ethnic cleansing.
Well, it's very much ethnic cleansing. And as we learned in 1948 and in 1967, ethnic cleansing is more than just forcibly displacing people from their homes or expelling them from their territory. It requires another element, which is to prevent their return once you've displaced them. And that's exactly what's going on here. I should add that Israel's statement that there is essentially no one left in the northern Gaza Strip and that those who have been forced out will not be allowed to return kind of masks a more sinister reality, which is that there are still many tens of thousands, perhaps even hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who remained in the northern Gaza Strip, either because they refused to leave or because they've seen what's happened to others who have tried to flee, which is that designated safe routes get bombed, children get sniped with a bullet through the head, and so on, or because they're unable to leave because, for example, they have elderly or infirm relatives who they're unable to transport because, of course, there's also no fuel and no civil defense vehicles or anything to help transport these people. And so while we should take these Israeli statements that no one will be allowed to return with the seriousness they deserve, I think the other aspect of it is that it masks what has quite clearly become a war of total annihilation. Every day there are bombings of homes, often in the middle of the night, in Beit Hanun, in Beit Lahia, in Jabalia refugee camp, in Jabalia al-Nazla, in the northern parts of the Gaza Strip and of Gaza City, and the western parts, where entire families are wiped out as they sleep. A dozen, 2 dozen, even 3 dozen men, women, and children being annihilated with a single bomb. And so we need to also, I think, stay very focused on what has become a war of annihilation, a war of extermination, if you will, on any Palestinian who has remained in the northern Gaza Strip.
And another development or another story that seems, or not seems, clearly consistent with a war of annihilation is the report that the Israeli army is allowing aid trucks to be looted by gangs in Gaza. So that there is an area in Gaza where which is known as the looting zone. And this looting zone is literally meters away from the Israeli army. But they don't prevent looters from stealing from the aid trucks, which the Palestinians in northern Gaza rely upon. This seems to be another example of how the goal of ethnic cleansing and eradication of Palestinians is being displayed in another form, which is that no aid is going to be allowed to go to Gaza, go to the Palestinians in northern Gaza. Is that how you see it as well?
Yes, well, here again, there are several things going on at the same time. First of all, no aid is being allowed into the most northern parts of Gaza that we were just discussing, Beit Hanun, Beit Lahia, Jabalia refugee camp, and Jabalia al-Nazla municipality. Nothing. And by aid, we're not talking about bags of rice and sugar. We're talking about any foodstuffs, any liquids, any medications, any fuel. Simply nothing is being allowed in. In the other parts of northern Gaza, where these supplies are allowed to trickle in, very far below what people need to survive normally. The Israelis have an additional objective, which is to prevent their orderly distribution, because those who would be responsible for that, whether the regular police force or any other organized group, are by Israel defined as Hamas. And in the past, the Israelis have deliberately targeted individuals involved in efforts at the orderly distribution of such aid. They've targeted them with snipers and with other weapons. And chaos is an objective here for Israel. And so, therefore, having these scenes of looting, where trucks are allowed in and then are allowed to be looted under the watchful eye of the Israelis because, as you mentioned, it's only a few meters from where they're based. This is precisely the plan. This is not a bug in the system. This is a system working as it is as it is intended to work.
Let's turn to Israel for our next story and the sacking of Defense Minister Yoav Galant. What's the story behind that? I mean, the two have not been seeing eye to eye on a number of issues. I don't assume for a minute that this is to do with his opposition to the genocide in Gaza. He's one of the main instigators. He's been wanted by there is a arrest warrants, application for arrest warrants against him. So it's not to do with that. So what is the story behind Netanyahu firing Yoav Galant?
Well, the background here is that Yoav Galant, who's a prominent member of the Likud party, which Netanyahu leads, and has leadership aspirations, and someone who has spent most of his career in Israel's security establishment, and is seen as representing the security establishment in the Israeli government, in the Israeli cabinet, and is also Washington's favorite war criminal, in the sense that he is seen as Washington's voice in deliberations within the Israeli government. Last year, in March of 2023, so months before October 7th and the subsequent Israel's subsequent genocidal campaign in the Gaza Strip, there had been repeated warnings that the polarization that was developing around Netanyahu's legislative agenda to overhaul the Israeli judiciary as part of kind of a authoritarian reboot of the Israeli state, Galant made a public statement that these initiatives and the polarization they were causing was damaging Israel's security, and that Israel's enemies were sensing weakness. That got him fired, but then a combination of public protest and opposition from Washington led him to be reinstated. The funny thing about Galant, if you will, is that he didn't listen to his own warnings because perhaps no one was caught with their pants as far down on October 7th as Galant, who was ultimately responsible for Israel's security posture on that day. What has happened in recent months is that the Israeli security establishment has been more open to a ceasefire agreement than Netanyahu and his far-right ministers in the Israeli government. They feel that Israel can afford to reach an agreement with Hamas, retrieve its captives and hostages, and then basically restart the war whenever they please. And they would like to focus more on the Israeli campaign in Lebanon, which has run into so many problems. Netanyahu wants to continue with the war. And not only that, if Netanyahu accepts even a temporary pause in the war, he will be deserted by his far-right neo-fascist coalition partners, or at least those are the threats that they've been making. But the most important breaking point between Galant and Netanyahu is that the Israeli military is facing a significant manpower shortage. And in that context, many of the ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel, what are known as the Haredim, have traditionally been provided with an exemption from conscription. And the idea is that they perform their national service through religious study, and that therefore they don't need to enter into the military. And in the context of the past year, where reservists have had to make repeated tours of duty, the issue of the Haredim continuing with their exemptions has led to not only growing polarization with Israeli society, but also there was a feeling within the Israeli security establishment that it needed to be addressed to deal with the manpower shortage. So when a draft legislation came up to begin conscripting the ultra-Orthodox teenagers, the Haredim, Galant stated that he would oppose continuing with their exemption. This created a new crisis between the Prime Minister Netanyahu on the one hand and the religious parties that form part of his coalition on the other. And these religious parties basically set Netanyahu a deadline and said, you know, if the continuing exemption of our youths does not get through the parliament, then we're going to collapse your coalition. So when the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, reconvened in October, and this issue came up again, and Galant was still opposing it, Netanyahu fired him. So, you know, this is kind of like Al Capone being sent to prison for tax violations rather than rather than multiple murders and all the other criminal activity he was involved in. It was these kind of more petty coalition issues, if you will, that led to Galant being fired. Now he's been replaced by Yisrael Katz, the former Israeli foreign minister, who has absolutely no experience in defense or security affairs, who you may remember as an absolute gas bag and windbag when he was foreign minister, and whose primary qualification for the position is that he is a spineless minion and effectively will, just as Netanyahu effectively served as the foreign minister when Katz was foreign minister, now Netanyahu is, for all intents and purposes, a defense minister as well, because Katz is such a spineless individual and is essentially his master's voice. The final point is that Netanyahu has sought to address the coalition issues this created by bringing in a former Likud leader who has since went off and formed his own party after falling out with Netanyahu, Gideon Sar. This is someone who was widely expected to be appointed as a defense minister, but has instead now been appointed as the new foreign minister.
It's another case of Netanyahu putting his political ambition ahead of the security of Israel. That's what it seems
Well,
to
if
me.
you think that Galant was an effective custodian of
No,
his
no.
security, we have over a year to demonstrate otherwise.
Yeah. Now, what I meant was, I think the military and the security officials understand that Israel faces a crisis of manpower. They need more troops, and having Haredim conscripted is probably the only way to ensure Israel has a steady supply of troops to fight the many wars it's seeking. And Netanyahu doesn't want to, for the sake of his coalition, concede to that. And that's what I meant when I said
Yeah,
it's
no,
okay.
you're right. And in 2024, that's definitely the case. But you know, these traditional exemptions that the Haredim have been enjoying over the decades were first instituted when they were a much smaller proportion of Israeli society, and their absence from the army was barely noticeable. Now, as you mentioned, you have a situation where not only are they a larger proportion of Israeli Jewish society, but Israel is also fighting more and longer wars simultaneously. So the manpower issue becomes significant. If I could just briefly reference two other relevant points. The first is that the security establishment now no longer has a surrogate sitting around the cabinet table, as it did with Galant. And this is potentially significant given the growing frictions we've been learning of between the government and particularly Netanyahu and his far-right allies. On the one hand, Ben Gvir and Smotrich, who were actually rejected for induction into the Israeli military because of their terrorist and extremist background. And so, you know, the polarization between the security establishment and the government and the frictions are expected to increase. The other point, of course, is that Galant functioned as a Biden administration's proxy in the Israeli government, and that's now gone too. And that may also be related to the US elections, where Netanyahu feels he no longer needs to give the Biden administration a seat at the table in his government because it's on its way out.
Let's move to a related story. So on the one hand, he's sacked Yoav Galant, but he's also appointed as US envoy, a really strange personality, someone by the name of, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, Yichel Leiter. So he will be the next US ambassador, Israeli ambassador to Washington. And this guy is an ex-member of the far-right Kahanist group, a group that was designated as a terrorist organization by the US itself and many other countries. We will, of course, speak about Trump and his foreign policy towards the Middle East and how Israel respond to Trump's re-election. But this suggests that Netanyahu feels that he can now annex the West Bank and the Gaza Strip with this appointment. This really does send a signal, don't you think, that this is the goal of Netanyahu with this appointment? Someone who was a member of an ex-terrorist organization, designated as such by the US itself. What do you think this signals?
Certainly, and it's also a poke in the eye of the U.S., which of course the U.S. will willingly accept. I mean, this ambassador designate, as you mentioned, he's a former member of the Jewish Defense League. The Jewish Defense League has been designated as a terrorist organization by the US government and is in fact responsible for the murder of a US citizen, Alex Ode, in California in 1985. So this is the equivalent kind of the Sinaloa cartel of the Mexican government appointing a former leader of the Sinaloa cartel as its ambassador to Washington. I mean, it's only in U.S.-Israeli relations would you see such a thing, and it also represents two things, I think. Kind of the consolidation of the far right, as we've been seeing across the West, on the one hand, um, given that Jewish power, the party in Israel's governing coalition, led by Itamar Ben-Gvir, is also an openly Kahanist power, which is now a trusted ally and partner of Washington. It also needs to be seen in that context of the normalization of the supremacist, genocidal Israeli far right by the U.S. and other Western states. And yes, they do come with a very clear, open, supremacist, annexationist, um, uh, ethnic cleansing agenda. And they're doing so, I think, in the widespread expectation that the Trump administration is going to accept the formal Israeli annexation of the occupied territories with however much ethnic cleansing as they'll be able to get away with.
And to add to that, Israel's trajectory being towards Jewish power and extremism is the fact that some hundreds of thousands of Israelis have left the country, and those that have left, you could say, politically on the center of Israel or the left of Israel, those who could have migrated or fled to the US or other countries, they're the ones who are leaving, which means that Israel would more and more increasingly become a state which espouses the policies of Jewish power. This is another example of that. And we will see more and more, I presume, over the next 4 years during the Trump era and afterwards, because Israel has no way of turning back the clock. The only direction it's heading towards is the direction of Jewish power and the Kahanist who wants to see ethnic cleansing of Palestine completed. But let's move on now to a different question, which is or different development. In Lebanon, we haven't spoken about Lebanon for a while.
Yes.
We've seen demolition of villages in southern Lebanon, demolition which I assume is reminiscent of what Israel did in 1948, when 500 or so Palestinian villages were demolished in order to prevent the return of Palestinians to their homes. And something similar is taking place in southern Lebanon, where Lebanese villages are being totally decimated and wiped out, forcing the Lebanese to move further north and not allowing them to return back to their villages. That's something that's been happening over the past months. Gideon Sa'ar, who you just mentioned, he said that there are progress in negotiations with Hezbollah, whereas Hezbollah, according to Al Jazeera, whereas Hezbollah has said that nothing official has reached the group. So what's the update on that? And tell us about the developments in Lebanon, which we've missed out on over the past 2-3 weeks.
Well, let's recount Israel's formal objectives with respect to its invasion of Lebanon. In October of 2023, right after the Hamas attacks of the 7th of October, which amounted to an offensive into southern Israel. That is the scenario that Israel had been planning for, but coming from Lebanon. In the chaos that came afterwards, Israel evacuated several tens of thousands of Israeli residents from its northern settlements on the border with Lebanon out of fear that there had been some kind of coordination between Hamas and Hezbollah would launch a much more effective offensive into northern Israel. So that's how it started. And then after Hezbollah opened its support front, it became very difficult for Israel to return these residents to the northern communities. So Israel's objectives when it went to war against Lebanon in early October was first of all to ensure that the residents of the northern communities could safely return to their homes. Secondly, to ensure that Hezbollah would be incapable of launching an October 7 style attack from southern Lebanon into northern Israel. And thirdly, to force Hezbollah to abandon its support front and thereby to de-link the Israeli Lebanese front from the Israeli Gaza front. And then, of course, as you'll recall, the massive blows Israel successfully inflicted on Hezbollah in terms of the assassination of almost its entire senior leadership, the pager and walkie-talkie attacks, and so on, led Israel to believe that it merely had to kind of launch a lightning invasion into southern Lebanon, and Hezbollah, which it believed was already on the verge of collapse, would completely disintegrate. Well, what has happened is that Hezbollah made a remarkable and remarkably rapid recovery and has been able to pin Israeli forces down on the immediate border zone so that Israeli forces have not been able to advance more than 2 or 3 kilometers into Lebanese territory. So what have they been doing? They've been going into these border villages, which as often as not are directly adjacent to the border, flattening them as they have been doing in Gaza, basically making them uninhabitable, and then moving back. According to some reports, we have no Israeli soldier has yet been able to overnight on Lebanese territory. That's how poorly this is going for Israel. But Israel's problem is that what it is doing in southern Lebanon only makes sense if it remains an occupation of that territory, because if they have to withdraw as the result of an agreement or they're expelled as they were in 2000, then the residents of these southern Lebanese communities can come back and begin rebuilding their homes, despite all the destruction and other measures that Israel has been taking to make those villages uninhabitable and to make the farmland unusable and so on. So that's the first thing Israel has been doing. Second thing Israel has been doing is to try to use what it perceived to be Hezbollah's weakness in September and October to seek to impose its preferred candidate and Washington's preferred candidate into the presidential palace in Beirut, kind of similar to what it did in 1982 when Bashir Gemayel was installed as president of Lebanon under the watchful eye of Israeli tanks. And it's also been seeking to sow dissension, sectarian tensions within Lebanon through its attacks on the civilian population, areas where Hezbollah is known not to have a presence or a constituency, and so on. In response, Hezbollah, rather than seeking to administer a knockout blow, has been seeking a process of gradual escalation by launching attacks primarily through rockets and missiles, but also with drones that are going further into Israel, that include larger warheads and that are more precise. And in contrast to Israel, Hezbollah has been focusing primarily on military targets. And by all accounts, Galant, one of his last statements was that Israel had defeated Hezbollah and was now in the process of destroying it. Well, if this is destruction, Israel still has a very, very long way to go before any objective observer would say that Hezbollah has been fatally weakened.
Another story from the region, Gulf in particular. Two stories I wanted to get your thoughts on. First is Qatar's decision to withdraw, as has been reported, from its role as mediator in truce talks between Israel and Hamas. Qatar is saying that the two parties are not negotiating in good faith. There was a story over the weekend that Qatar had said that it will expel Hamas officials. That story turned out to be false. That is not the case. But this story, it does seem to be has coming from a reliable source. So I want to get your thoughts on that. And also the Riyadh summit that's taking place today in the Saudi capital. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, he's been quite vocal during the summit. He described Israel's actions in Gaza as genocide, and stressed that Palestinian issue remains a central issue to the Arab countries. I mean, do you think this summit is taking place partly because maybe there is a way for the Arab countries to force Trump's hand before he takes office in January? One way they could do that is for the Saudi and the Iranian to deepen their reconciliation, presuming Trump would seek a maximum pressure policy on Iran. If the Saudis now decide to reconcile with the Iranians, maybe that will make Trump think twice. So is there a way for the Arab countries to force Trump's hand, and could this be a way of doing this? So there's two questions there.
Yes, well, to take the Qatari issue first, last week we began seeing reports that probably originated in Israel that Qatar, under US pressure, had informed the Hamas leadership that it was being expelled from Doha, where it had been based now for over a decade. Qatar has officially denied that this is the case. So unless there is something going on we're not aware of, that appears to be a false report. The other report, which Qatar has confirmed, is that it is suspending its mediation efforts until both parties demonstrate seriousness of purpose in reaching a ceasefire agreement that would also include a change of captives. I think Qatar blaming both parties is probably in deference to American sensibilities, because, as you know, the American position is that Israel has been doing everything it can to reach an agreement, and it is only because of the Palestinians that none has been reached. Whereas anyone who has spent even 10 minutes looking at this issue, or 10 seconds for that matter, understands that neither Israel nor the United States have ever been serious about reaching a permanent ceasefire in Gaza, or indeed in reaching an agreement for the release and exchange of captives and hostages. So Qatar basically said it's suspending its mediation activities until seriousness of purpose is demonstrated. My own view is that this is a decision that should have been taken many months ago, not only by Qatar, but also by Egypt, because, as everyone understands, there haven't been serious negotiations, nor are there going to be. And this constant shuttling back and forth about new proposals and new discussions and so on has really served almost exclusively as a fig leaf for what's actually happening on the ground. So it's become a charade that has at some level served to legitimize the continuation of the war, because negotiations are being conducted to end it. So Qatar suspending its role is, I think, a positive development, and I very much hope Egypt does as well, and that they both will be more explicit in identifying who the culprit is. Is it really Hamas that is blocking a ceasefire agreement? Every time these discussions. And U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is trotted out to point the finger at Hamas. But again, it's Netanyahu who has been shifting the goalposts. So I think a clear statement from Doha and from Cairo about who is responsible for the stalemate. Is it really Hamas, or is it Israel and Washington? You know, most recently we were told that Sinwar is the main obstacle. Well, he was killed many weeks ago, and there has been exactly zero progress in the negotiations since then. So quite clearly, the obstacle is to be found somewhere else. That's kind of a long way of saying this whole thing has been a charade, and the sooner it's put out of our misery, the better. Regarding Riyadh, it's a very interesting development because, as you may recall, last November, late November, early December of 2023, Riyadh was expected to convene an emergency Arab League summit to address what had become an increasingly genocidal campaign by Israel in the Gaza Strip. Saudi Arabia's de facto leader, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, then expanded the summit to include not only the Arab League, but also the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, thereby adding dozens of additional governments to that summit. And this was seen at the time as a transparent attempt to water down any resolution that might emerge from the summit in deference to both Israel and the United States. And in fact, the only meaningful decision that was adopted at that resolution was that those attending that summit would immediately begin with the delivery of urgently needed humanitarian aid to the Palestinian population of the Gaza Strip, and would do so irrespective of any threats by Israel or the United States not to deliver it. Well, they took all those threats very seriously and refused to send even a grain of wheat or a vial of medicine or a drop of water or a drop of fuel into the Gaza Strip unless they first had Israeli approval for doing so. And given that once again it's being held as a joint summit between the Arab League and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, we're seeing much of the same cynicism. And at one level, that cynicism about what this meeting is expected to produce is entirely warranted. At the same time, as you've suggested, we're now in very different circumstances. On the one hand, the change of administration in Washington coming up this January. And at the same time, Saudi Arabia and some of its partners in the Gulf Cooperation Council are also very concerned that Israel, which had once been viewed by many of them as a reliable security partner, is now seen as a threat, which appears determined to set the entire region aflame. And should it come to a direct Iranian-Israeli confrontation that continues to escalate and that goes on for a longer period of time, they're, of course, in the front line, and it will be those states sitting immediately across the Persian Gulf from Iran that will be its primary victims. They also recall very well that during the first Trump administration, when Ansar Allah, the Houthis in Yemen, were firing missiles and drones at Saudi Arabia and then also the United Arab Emirates. And when Iran launched a very sophisticated drone and missile attack on the Aramco oil facilities in Saudi Arabia, the Trump administration basically did nothing in response. So I think, given concerns about a potential joint U.S.-Israeli offensive against Iran that would leave them thoroughly exposed, I think you're right to suggest that this can also be seen as kind of a preventive measure by these states to seek to reduce escalation tensions before the Trump administration comes into office. And indeed, in recent months, we've seen an unprecedented level of diplomacy, of meetings, even of joint exercises between Iran and the GCC states. Now, just in response to the final part of your question, yes, it will be very interesting to see to what extent Saudi Arabia and its GCC partners are able to mobilize their clout to prevent the Trump administration from acting in league with Israel to set the entire region aflame in the form of a much escalated campaign against Iran.
Let's turn our attention to the big story in Europe from the past few days, which is the riots in Amsterdam. There's been so much misinformation about it.
Say the
You are
least.
you are a Dutch Palestinian, so I'll leave it to you to clarify and add your thoughts to that. I don't really want to say much. So tell us give us your thoughts on what's been happening and what is the real take from the riots in Amsterdam.
Well, it's really an exceptional story. I mean, as the commentator Philip Proudfoot put it, this is probably the first time in history that Western leaders and media have collectively expressed their thoughts and prayers and dedicated them to a gang of racist, genocidal football hooligans. What's
They're known
happened?
for that, by the way. They're known, universally known for being an extremely far
Yes,
right
yes.
support base. Anyway,
Yes,
sorry.
even by Israeli standards, they're
Mm.
considered extreme. So imagine that. I mean, what's happened here is that there was a Europa League match between this club, Maccabi Tel Aviv, and their Dutch hosts, Ajax Amsterdam. The clashes were not between the supporters, rival supporters of these two teams, but rather began when the Maccabi Tel Aviv supporters rampaged through the center of Amsterdam, attacking anything of Arab appearance. So they attacked homes that were flying Palestinian flags. They started attacking taxi drivers, of whom a good proportion are of North African origin, beat one into the hospital where he's apparently still located, vandalized a bunch of taxis, one of which was completely destroyed, started attacking people with sticks and metal pipes and bicycle chains, and so on. And not only did they go on this rampage, but they actually were able to do so under the protection of the Dutch police. I mean, it's normal for the supporters of visiting teams to get a police escort on their way to the stadium, out of precaution, of clashes between rival hooligans and so on. But I mean, just to give you a comparison, it's my understanding that when British teams go to Europe to play such games, the British supporters are usually accompanied by British police, not so much to protect them from hooligans from the rival team, but to ensure that there are no hooligans among them. In this case, the Amsterdam police just let these savages go their merry way and were in fact arresting people they assaulted, rather than the Israelis who were assaulting them. So they get to the stadium, singing, chanting slogans like their favorite chants, of course, "Death to the Arabs" and "May your village burn." I mean, imagine if supporters of an Arab team were marching through the center of Amsterdam chanting "Death to the Jews" and so on. Anyway, so they get to the stadium. Then they start chanting, what is it? "There are no schools in Gaza because all the children are dead." Um, a moment of silence is held for the victims of the recent floods at Valencia in Spain, but because Spain hasn't been the most enthusiastic cheerleader of Israel's genocide in Gaza, the Israeli fans, many of whom, by the way, have served in its genocidal armed forces during the past year, start booing, whistling loudly, setting off flares, and so on. Then the game ends. As they are returning to their hotels, they begin engaging in the same violent conduct. But this time, they're met by opposition. In some cases, spontaneously. In other cases, people had organized and were prepared to confront them. So a bunch of them were beaten up. 5 were hospitalized. All 5 were released the following day, in contrast to the taxi driver, who was apparently still in hospital. And then the police perform 60 arrests. Not a single Israeli was handcuffed. They were all Dutch who were arrested for having the temerity to confront these racist thugs. But what happened then is almost immediately you began hearing stories about an anti-Semitic pogrom in the center of Amsterdam, of Islamic radicals going on what was termed a Jew hunt, of Kristallnacht 2024. And bear in mind, this took place on the 7th of November, 2 days before the annual commemoration of Kristallnacht. And Dutch politicians start getting into the act. You have the strongman of the Netherlands, the far-right effective head of government, de facto, Geert Wilders. Then you have the Prime Minister, Dick Schoof, the former spy chief. You have the mayor of Amsterdam, the former leader of the Green Left Party, Femke Halsema. You have Wilders' coalition partners, and they're all trying to outbid each other in denouncing their own citizens and rushing to the defense of these racist thugs, because there's not just what was actually happening in Amsterdam, but there's also this war of position and war of influence among these various Dutch players. So Wilders, because he's been excluded from the premiership, is using these events to try to increase his power over the government and and further subordinate the prime minister who he appointed to his power. The prime minister is trying to preserve his own authority. The mayor of Amsterdam, who's from a different party, is trying also to preserve her position. The coalition partners don't want to be outdone in hysteria and extremism, so they start making statements of their own. And now all of a sudden, clashes between Amsterdammers and racist, genocidal, visiting Israeli football hooligans, or even attacks against these Israelis, has been compared to the rise of Nazism in the 1930s, and is even being directly compared to the Holocaust. I mean, it's incredible. And the media, of course, is 175% complicit in this. I mean, we had the incident of Sky News putting out an accurate report, then deleting it, then replacing it with one that fit more with the false narrative, and then deleting its initial report and deleting evidence that it had deleted its initial report. I mean, no one was killed, but even so, by comparison with the horrible coverage of the genocide in Gaza, this one, I think, takes the biscuit. It's an absolute scandal, the way the Dutch political class, including even the Dutch monarch, King Willem-Alexander, have willfully thrown their own citizens under the bus in defense of a bunch of racist, genocidal football hooligans and in deference to a genocidal apartheid state. It's a scandal, an extraordinary scandal.
Uh, I don't think the mainstream media realizes how corrosive this kind of coverage really is, because many like me would have felt this was gaslighting on a global scale. Everyone clearly knew what was happening, and football hooliganism is a culture in itself. And to frame this as genocide, pogrom, as Kristallnacht, many would rightly then question the true historical accounts of what Kristallnacht actually is, what pogrom really was, which was brutal targeting of Jews. And if you now, as a media organization and heads of state like Biden and others here in the UK, Starmer, describe these as pogroms, then you're really undermining the very history of pogroms and the brutality of those pogroms. Yeah, I was quite shocked. I mean, initially, I did not really follow the story until the following day. And then having realized how much we were being gaslit on a global scale, I just thought, if the mainstream media had any doubts about why people are losing faith in their coverage, this was really a clear example of why, from the left, from the right, from every sector of society, they're just losing all trust they've ever had from their viewers. But anyway, thanks for that lengthy explanation. And we've spoken at length on a number of shows about journalistic malpractice, and I think this genocide is really the incident or the global the final straw that will break the back of journalism in the West.
Yes, if I can just, what's been most shocking to me is the way in which the Dutch king, the Dutch prime minister, the effective ruler of this country, Geert Wilders, his coalition partners, the Dutch media, basically the entire Dutch elite, have been willingly dragging their country's reputation through the mud by confirming and amplifying this absolute hoax that what happened in Amsterdam was not people resisting racist, genocidal football hooligans, arguably excessively so, certainly with violence. But presenting this, validating these stories that this was a pogrom, that this was Kristallnacht 2024, that this was a hunt for Jews. I mean, if it was a hunt for Jews, it wouldn't have only been the Maccabi Tel Aviv supporters. There are thousands and thousands of Dutch Jews in Amsterdam. We don't have evidence that they were attacked. We don't have evidence that their institutions were targeted. We haven't seen crystals from Jewish-owned stores and homes all over the streets in Amsterdam, as we saw in Germany on Kristallnacht. In fact, the only properties that were attacked were those that were, for example, flying Palestinian flags. And they've been willingly amplifying this absolute hoax, dragging their country's reputation through the mud, throwing their own citizens under the bus, all in order to kind of gain advantage over each other in this Byzantine war of position in Dutch politics. That, to me, is a core part of the scandal.
And another thing I'd like to add to that is just there's something much more dark and sinister at play here, which is that Israelis can never be the aggressors. They have to always be presented as the victims, even if the supporters and the hooligans are, as we know, from extreme far right, and they support the expulsion of the Palestinians. They can never be the victims. And what was shocking is how all the media, nearly all the media, many global leaders, it's almost as if they were disciplined to respond to something like that and issue tweets, issue condemnation without even getting to the bottom of the story.
Well,
Same with them.
Yes,
Yeah.
sorry if I can interrupt you, that's the other part of this. I mean, if you're Biden, if you're Starmer, if you're the Dutch prime minister, or if you're Schulz, the German premier, then of course you want to present this as being an extension of the Holocaust, because the alternative, I mean, there's only one of two options here. Um, Either Israel, the state that they're arming and supporting, is engaging in genocide and apartheid and they're fully complicit in it, or the real story here is not anything Israel is doing. The real story here is anti-Semitism and Jew hunt and Kristallnacht and all the rest of it. And those who you are arming to the teeth to slaughter thousands and thousands of infants and babies, they're actually the victims. Not the babies, but the Israeli soldiers are the ones who are the victims here.
Let's turn our attention to the final segment of this week's review, which is Trump's victory in the US elections. We spoke about it last week. Of course, that was before Trump was elected. Again, most of the polls, I would say, got it wrong. But I think for us, I mean, what's important to look at is, first of all, do we think Gaza played a role, the Gaza genocide played a role in Harris's defeat? I mean, polls after polls showed that foreign policy is not really high on the agenda, but I'm sure character is, and if you are a character like Harris and you fail to condemn genocide, even if foreign policy is not a big issue, that is a reflection on your character, which shows what kind of person you really are. So what kind of I think what was the role of the Gaza genocide in the election? And the other part, I think the more interesting or important part for us to analyze is what would a Trump second term mean for the MENA region, in particular the Palestinian issue. We spoke about this Riyadh summit and how the Arab countries are maybe seeking to force Trump's hand in some shape or form. But let's see. I mean, I don't. We kind of have a clear idea, somewhat clear idea what Trump second term would look like, given what he did in his first term. But there is another current in the US at the moment, which is America first isolationism. But that could be isolationism from all other parts of the world, but not Palestine. So
Yeah.
what's your take on that?
Well, to take your first point first, Harris was such a horrible candidate, and the Democrats ran such a horrible campaign that Trump won by such a large margin that ultimately Palestine, genocide, Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, youth were not a primary reason for her loss. I mean, the gaps were that large. Having said that, I think it's important to note that this is really the first time in modern American history in which Arab Americans were considered a significant constituency to be taken account of. And the interesting thing is that the way Harris dealt with this constituency, I think quite deliberately and in a calculated manner, was to make repeated public shows of contempt for them. So, they sent Bill Clinton to Michigan, which is one of the states where you have the largest concentrations of Arab Americans, to start basically explaining that the West Bank is really Judea and Samaria, that the Israelis were there first, that it's the Palestinians' fault so many of their children are being slaughtered, and all the same racist tropes. And then they sent, I think, Richie Torres, who's one of the most fanatically extreme pro-Israeli members of Congress. So it was these calculated, deliberate shows of contempt for a constituency that in 2020 had overwhelmingly voted for Biden, that presumably Harris and the Democratic Party machine thought would ingratiate her with the donors. Well, yes, America is a plutocracy, and it's ultimately money that decides most elections. But you also need to get votes. And if you look at if you look at the figures, um, Trump got fewer votes than he did in 2020, but he still got won the popular vote in contrast to 2016 and 2020 because Harris performed so much more poorly than either Hillary Clinton in 2016 or Biden in 2020. And I think the election itself is significant because it wasn't only Arab Americans or Muslim Americans, but it was also many youths who basically decided that they couldn't cross the moral boundary of voting for someone who was openly embracing a genocidal regime and was so openly contemptuous of those being slaughtered by the tens of thousands. And did this cost her the election? I don't think so, but it contributed to her loss. And as some people have pointed out, when you get so many people refusing to vote for Harris in the full knowledge that they know exactly what the result is going to be, which is namely Donald Trump, about whom so much is known, that should tell you something. That Harris and her policies and genocide, as several people, including I think Jeffrey Sachs and John Mersheimer have pointed out, genocide is a red line that they were simply unprepared to cross, irrespective of the consequences. And as some people have pointed out, Democrats need to learn that there are consequences to their actions, and only by being punished at the voting booth, even in the full knowledge that the alternative is Trump, when they finally realize that people find their that when people determine that it represents such a bright red moral red line they can't cross, that it results in that they're prepared to enable the Trump administration to replace it. Only when that gets seared into the consciousness of the Democratic Party will they perhaps to begin to reevaluate their policies and positions. So that would be my first comment with respect to the elections. With respect to the incoming Trump administration, the problem with providing a coherent answer to your question is that Trump himself is so incoherent. He's even more erratic than he was during his first term, to the extent that any policy you might suppose that he's going to adopt or its opposites are equally plausible. It was Trump who unilaterally renounced the Iranian nuclear agreement in 2018. He has already said he will continue with the policy of maximum pressure. It's entirely plausible that he will, in alliance and coordination with the Israelis, seek to administer a death blow to the regime in Tehran, and in so doing, blow up the entire region. But it's equally plausible that Trump, understanding that he has a significant constituency that's either anti-war or isolationist, and given Trump's own positions of not wanting to be involved in a major war in the Middle East that will make Iraq look like child's play, it's equally plausible that he will force Netanyahu to stand down in order to ensure that the Americans don't get directly involved in an armed conflict. So maybe the best I can do in answer to your question is he's very erratic, so there are multiple possibilities. Some of it will depend on the people he appoints. He's already told the neocons, Pompeo and Haley, that they will not be part of his new administration. But he's also appointed Brian Hook, an Iran hawk, and Elise Stefanik, a fanatic Zionist, as his permanent representative to the United Nations. Part of it will depend on what the actual situation is on January 20th. What will have happened between now and then? Because the reality on that day, I think, will have a significant influence on the policies that Trump adopts. And I think maybe the only thing we can say with certainty is that Trump will most likely continue to make all the weapons that the Biden administration has gifted to Israel. Those will all continue to be available, but Trump will probably insist that, in contrast to the current situation, that Israel start paying for them. The only other question mark is, to what extent will Washington's Arab client regimes, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and others, seek to use their influence with his administration to try to change its policies towards Israel and Palestine out of a sense of self-preservation? Will they do so? And if they choose to do so, to what extent will they succeed? That, I think, remains an open question as well.
Yeah, I think a lot will depend on his handlers. I mean, I see Trump as a vessel for people around him to push through whatever agenda they have. And I think there is also a large constituency within the US, right, who are seeking America to become more isolationist. On the issue of Palestine, I think that they'll be very disappointed. I think when it comes
If I
to...
may, excuse me for interrupting, that's the other point I wanted to make. I think Trump endorsing formal Israeli annexation, which he effectively already did in 2020, is more or less a foregone conclusion. Again, unless Washington's Arab partners make clear that there will be consequences for doing so. And on the evidence, that's not going to happen.
Yeah. And then if he is to revive the Abraham Accords, if Saudi has been saying so far that its normalization is tied to a two-state solution, if the two-state solution is not on the table, we'll have to wait and see, and let's see what comes out of this summit. But as always, Mouin, it's a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.
See you again next week, and see you also who have tuned in to listen to our weekly review with me, Nasim Ahmed, and Mouin Rabbani. Bye-bye.